Before I get started, I want to acknowledge that some of my Tlingit pronunciations may not be correct, and for that I sincerely apologize. I recognize that I have a lot to learn. One phrase that I have learned is ayakagwe, which means, is that correct? I try to carry that mindset with me as I learn. I've also been encouraged that trying is better than not trying at all, so I do my best to engage and learn as I go, while also understanding that there is much more that I can do to improve. Goodness cheesh for your patience. This is a reflective review of Haa Shuká, Our Ancestors, Tlingit Oral Narratives, and its relevance to Indigenous knowledge and identity by Nona Dimond for Alaska Native Studies 101 for the final assignment. For this project, it was really important for me to understand who the authors were because of their backgrounds directly shaping the book. Nora Marks Dauenhauer was a Tlingit elder from southeast Alaska and a member of the Lakayeti clan of the Raven Moiety. She was raised within the Tlingit language, culture, traditions, and she dedicated her life to preserving and sharing that knowledge. She was not just a scholar, but also a poet and a culture bearer, which really comes through in the ways that the stories are presented. Richard Dauenhauer was a linguist and translator who worked closely alongside Nora. His role focused on documenting and translating the Tlingit language in a way that stayed as true as possible to its original meaning and structure. Together, their work is really powerful because it brings both perspectives. Nora provided the lived cultural knowledge and connection to the community, while Richard contributed the technical skills needed to document and translate the language. Their collaboration allowed them to preserve these oral narratives in a way that respects both the language and the cultural meaning behind it. This reflective review attempts to show that Haa Shuká, Our Ancestors' Tlingit Oral Narratives, is not just a collection of stories, but a deliberate act of cultural preservation and resistance. It also highlights how current language revitalization efforts, such as those led by Krune Lance Twitchell, reflect the revitalization of the author's vision. When I picked up this book from the library, I didn't expect it to affect me the way it did. It was a sunny day, and I just planned for it to sit for a few minutes and flip through it. But as it sat on my desk, I opened to the preface and started reading. Within a few sentences, I was in tears. There's a line early on that says this collection is not for everyone, but for those who want to understand who they are and who the Tlingit people are. It goes on to say that only through stories and traditions like these do we begin to understand who we are, and that really stayed with me. The preface also talks about language loss. At the time, there were very few young speakers and real concern that Tlingit may not be taught in schools at all. Reading that and knowing where we are today made me think about how far we've come and how much work there is still left. This book was published in 1987, and at that time, I was best friends with Jamie, who was Nora's granddaughter. I was largely unaware of the depth of this work that was being done, but I was welcomed into Indigenous spaces and places with their family. I shared meals, time, and memories that, looking back now, feel like such a gift and an honor. Growing up, my broader understanding of Tlingit culture was limited. I either saw it in ceremony or heard harmful stereotypes, and there didn't seem to be much in between. So, sitting here now in 2026, reading this work, it feels so different. There's grief in recognizing what was lost, but also hope in seeing what is being rebuilt. I only wish that Nora and Richard were here today to see the work that's being done. In discussing the author's intent and methods is where we really start to see Haa Shuká, our ancestors' Tlingit Oral Narratives, doing so much more than simply just documenting stories. The primary intent of Nora and Richard Dowenhauer was to preserve Tlingit language and worldview. This wasn't just about saving words, it was about protecting a way of understanding the world, relationships, and identity. They also aimed to document oral traditions authentically and to ensure that this knowledge could be passed down to future generations. The way that they chose to do this is really important. Their method involved recording and translating narratives directly from Tlingit elders and then presenting those stories side by side in both Tlingit and English. This allows the language to exist in its original form rather than being fully filtered through translation. They also made a deliberate choice to maintain the storytelling voice. Instead of reshaping these narratives into a Western academic format, they preserved the rhythm, structure, and perspective of oral storytelling. This design decision really matters because it keeps the integrity of the stories intact from the original storyteller. From a more analytical standpoint, this approach is highly reliable culturally because it centers Indigenous voices rather than interpreting them from the outside. And in many ways, this can be understood as a form of decolonizing research practices. It resists the idea that knowledge has to be translated, reshaped, or validated through the Western framework in order to have value. One of the greatest strengths of this method is that it honors oral tradition rather than replacing it, and it creates space for the language and the stories to exist as they are, which is essential for cultural continuity. At the same time, there's a challenge here. For readers who are not familiar with Tlingit language or cultural context, part of the text may be difficult to fully understand. But I would argue that this difficulty is not a flaw, it actually reflects the depth and specificity of the knowledge being shared. And that's where I want to connect the videos that I'm including. These are clips from Kune Lance Twitchell's class, and you can see that the text is being spoken, practiced, and brought to life. And you see young people engaging with the language, learning pronunciation, and building fluency in a way that directly reflects what the Dowenhauers were working toward. So what was once at risk of being lost is now actively taught, spoken, and lived. The book is no longer just a record. It becomes a teaching tool. It's a bridge between generations and part of an ongoing process of that revitalization.
Gwallia chana ach tuasagu we naskshkalnik aya yewa ach tuasagu utua achi hastu cheidach shadach dach a chot away we kak aka away tak a yewa chutichia ach tuasagu gwalla etraya wujin yuchakach tutla ati dushkalnik idat Kaya Kakwedi Ya Shadang Wasayak Aya do Yukatangi Yewe Kadinuk Ewatan Ya
Fine verb. Do something quickly, poorly, to do it haphazardly, and they're manageable in Tlingit. But I think there are things that a lot of students who are going from the intermediate level to the advanced level need to just learn how to use. Especially when it comes to oratory, I think they're really helpful. And as you sort of get a list of them, and this is probably most of them, if not nearly all of them, I'm sure there's quite a few others that we're still trying to figure out, and they hadn't been documented They've been documented in different ways, but I think now we're getting a better understanding of how they work. So the first one, these are not adjectives. These are adverbs. So cross out adjectives, write down adverbs. So these are all, this first list is all adverbs. So what I want to do.
Moving into the critical analysis of language loss and revitalization, I want to return to the key point from the preface of Haa Shuká, Our Ancestors' Tlingit Oral Narratives. At the time that this book was written, there were very few young Tlingit speakers, and there was a real fear that the language would not survive in schools or be passed down to future generations. This reality reflects the broader impacts of colonialization, particularly through systems like boarding schools and forced assimilation, where Indigenous languages were actively suppressed and oftentimes punished with violence. Language loss in this context was not accidental. It was part of a larger effort to erase culture and identity. Because of that, this book functions as more than just a collection of stories. It acts as both a cultural archive, preserving language and knowledge, and it's also a call to action, urging future generations to carry this work forward. To explore this further, I want to look at two stories from the collection, both entitled The Woman Who Married the Bear. These versions are told respectively by Tom Peters and Frank Dick Jr. While these stories are very similar, they also contain important differences, and those differences actually tell us something meaningful about oral tradition. In Tom Peters' version, the story begins in a place where animals are being hunted, specifically mentioning moose. Based on that detail, we might interpret the setting as late summer or early fall, aligning with traditional hunting seasons and berry picking. In contrast, in Frank Dick Jr.'s version, he describes the season as changing into spring or early summer, with women going out to gather Indian celery. So right away we see a difference in seasonal context. There's also differences in the type of bear. In Tom Peters' version, it's a brown bear, while in Frank Dick Jr.'s version, it is a black bear. So these variations and the variations of the vegetables that the women are picking reflect differences in geographical location or tribal affiliation of the storytellers. So at the same time, the core structure of the story remains consistent. In both versions, the woman slips on bear droppings and insults the bear out loud, which ultimately leads to her encounter and relationship with the bear. These similarities show that while details may shift over time, across families and between communities and tribes, the center teachings and themes of the story remain intact. This is the strength of oral tradition. It's not static, it adapts, it reflects place, and it carries meaning across generations, even if the details evolve. So when we look deeper at both stories of the woman who married a bear, one of the most important things to understand is that there isn't just one singular version of this story. And while this book presents two, there may be hundreds. Depending on the storyteller, the family, or the tribe, the details can shift. Certain moments might be emphasized differently, characters might be described in unique ways, and even parts of the plot can change slightly. But even with those differences, the core teachings of the story remain consistent. At its heart, this story teaches respect for animals, the power of your words, the deep interconnectedness between humans and the natural world, the consequences of disrespect, learning through lived experience, cultural responsibility, and the idea that some actions cannot be undone. Many of these are recognizable as tribal values. So those lessons stay intact, no matter who's telling the story. What changes are the details, and those details are not mistakes or distortions. They are what make the oral storytelling so powerful. They reflect the voice, the experience, and the identity of the people carrying that story forward. So in that way, the variations actually give ownership to the families and the tribes who pass these stories down. Each version becomes rooted in a specific place or a specific lineage and with a specific perspective. I think that a really helpful way to understand this is to compare this to family stories in our own lives. For example, two families might both have stories about a holiday gathering, a funny childhood moment, or a major life event. The general situation might be similar, but the details and the way that story is told and what gets emphasized are what makes it feel like it's your family's story. Oral narratives work in the same way. The shared teachings connect the stories across communities, but those unique details are what make each version meaningful and personal. So rather than seeing differences in these stories as inconsistencies, it's more accurate to see them as expressions of cultural identity, continuity, and living tradition, and a way of carrying tribal values forward. In connecting Haa Shuká to what we've learned throughout the semester in Alaska Native Studies, I see three major themes that continue to emerge across our readings. The first is the connection between language and identity. Throughout the semester, we've explored how Indigenous language loss is not just about losing words, it's about losing ways of understanding the world. Language carries relationships, values, names, and the ways of thinking that do not always translate directly to English. What this book makes clear is that Tlingit language is deeply tied to identity, not just individually, but collectively. When language is preserved and revitalized, it strengthens cultural identity and reconnects people to who they are and where they come from. The second theme is decolonization. As we've explored throughout the semester, the disruption of Indigenous language and culture did not happen by accident. It was part of a broader system that created distance between people, identity, and their communities. And what stands out in Haa Shuká and the works of Gune Lance Twitchell is how that disruption is being actively challenged. Language revitalization today is not just about learning vocabulary, it is a form of resistance. It's a way of restoring what was intentionally interrupted. But what feels especially important is where this work is happening. We are currently taking Alaska Native Studies, and this is now considered a general education requirement for degree-seeking students. That alone represents a meaningful shift. Indigenous knowledge is no longer being pushed to the margins, but recognized as essential. We're also seeing this through institutional changes, such as the recent partnership between the Central Council of Tlingit and Haida Indian Tribes of Alaska and the University of Alaska Southeast to develop an Indigenous school within the university system. This shows that the work is being built into the structure of higher education itself. And this work is being carried forward by leaders like Dr. Angela Lunda, who are actively working to re-indigenize educational practices. This includes encouraging both learners and educators to strengthen their connection to culture and community, even while operating within a Western academic framework. So what we are seeing is not just resistance from the outside, but transformation from within. The same systems that once contributed to language loss are now being reshaped into spaces of revitalization. And the third theme is community and responsibility. A consistent idea across our course has been that knowledge is not individual, it is relational. Indigenous knowledge systems emphasize connection to family, community, and land. The stories in this book reflect that. They're not just narratives. They carry teaching about how to live, how to act, how to be in relationship with others, and with the environment. These stories also place responsibility on the listener. They ask us to remember to learn and to carry that knowledge forward. The idea of responsibility has been central to what we've learned this semester, that understanding is not passive. It comes with an obligation to act. So when we look at all of that together, Haa Shuká is not separate from what we've studied. It is a living example of it. It reflects the impacts of disruption, the importance of language to identity, and the ongoing work of revitalization and responsibility with Indigenous communities. And I leave you now with this clip from the Sealaska Heritage Institute on Haa Shuká.
Haa Shuká, honoring our ancestors and future generations. A long time ago, people said we could not speak our native languages. In school, if you spoke your native language, you would have to write, "I will not speak Indian" 100 times. Times are changing, and times have passed. People like Elizabeth Pratovich and Martin Luther King Jr. inspired Native people to embrace our cultures and speak our languages. In modern days, we want to learn our languages and we want to teach our children. I will speak Tlingit. I will speak Hadkil. I will speak Samalgich. I will teach Tlingit. I will teach Hadkil. I will teach Samalgich. I love my language. I am living our cultural values. Haa Shuká, honoring our ancestors and future generations.